Welcome and relax. Take a moment to settle in, breathe deeply, and let your mind drift. Feel the quiet around you, the gentle rhythm of your thoughts, and the calm that surrounds this moment. Listen and simply be. Long before cities had names, walls, or crowded streets, human life unfolded in quiet, scattered ways. Small groups lived close to the land, moving with the seasons, guided by water, weather, and familiarity. There was no clear center, no permanent place where everything gathered. Life was spread out, simple, and deeply connected to the rhythms of nature. Over time, something subtle began to change. As farming took root and food became more reliable, people no longer needed to move as often. Fields returned harvests year after year. Animals were kept close. Tools improved slowly, passed from hand to hand, from one generation to the next. With stability came presence, and with presence came gathering. Families settled near one another, not out of design, but convenience. A water source, fertile soil, a familiar path. What began as a few homes gradually became clusters. Paths formed where feet passed often. Shared spaces appeared without being planned, places to meet, to trade, to talk, to rest. These early settlements did not feel like cities as we imagine them today. There were no grand structures, no organized streets, no clear boundaries. Yet something important was happening. Human life was beginning to concentrate. As more people remained in one place, daily routines slowly intertwined. Work became visible. One person shaped tools while another tended animals. Someone stored grain. Someone else repaired homes. Knowledge began to specialize, quietly and naturally, without formal roles or titles. With shared life came shared challenges. Water had to be managed. Food had to be protected. Disputes had to be settled. These needs did not arrive suddenly. They unfolded gradually, emerging from everyday life itself. Solutions were practical at first: simple rules, familiar voices, mutual understanding. Over time, certain places within these settlements took on greater meaning: a central open area, a storage space, a place for gathering during important moments. These locations became anchors, points around which daily life revolved. As generations passed, the settlement remained. Children were born into the same place their grandparents had known. Memory became tied to location. Stories attached themselves to land. The idea of here gained weight, not just as a place to live, but as a place to belong. Slowly, density increased. More homes were built closer together. Paths became worn into recognizable routes. Boundaries formed, not as walls, but as understanding. Where one settlement ended, an open land began. Trade emerged between neighboring groups, bringing unfamiliar goods and new ideas. With trade came awareness. People began to recognize that their settlement was part of something larger. Other places existed beyond the horizon, other ways of living, other customs, other materials. This awareness did not create urgency, only curiosity. As settlements grew, organization followed, not through grand planning, but through repetition. Tasks that worked were repeated, practices that failed were abandoned. Over time, these patterns hardened into tradition. And without anyone deciding it should be so, the earliest cities began to form. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, shaped by habit, necessity, and the quiet pull of human connection. Life had not rushed forward. It had simply gathered. As life gathered more tightly within these early settlements, the presence of others became a constant. Sounds of work filled the air, grinding stone, flowing water, footsteps crossing familiar paths. The settlement was no longer a collection of separate lives, but a shared environment shaped by many hands. With more people living close together, cooperation became essential. Tasks that once could be handled alone now benefited from shared effort. Fields were prepared together, irrigation channels were dug and maintained as a group, storage spaces were protected not just for one family, but for many. This growing interdependence slowly changed how people understood their place within the community. Survival was no longer only personal, it was collective. One person's effort affected another's well-being. Small decisions rippled outward, influencing daily life across the settlement. As populations increased, so did the need for structure. Not structure imposed from above, but patterns that emerged through experience. Certain individuals became known for their skills, not through titles, but through trust. One person was sought out for tools, another for organizing shared work, another for settling disagreements when words alone were not enough. These roles were informal, flexible, and deeply human. Authority did not come from power, but from familiarity. People listened to those they knew, those whose actions had proven reliable over time. Space itself began to change. Homes were built closer together, not by design, but necessity. Open land within the settlement became valuable. Areas once used freely now had purpose. Some spaces were reserved for storage, others for gathering. Movement through the settlement followed increasingly familiar routes worn into the ground by repeated use. As daily life became denser, privacy became rarer. People lived in constant awareness of one another. Sounds traveled easily. Actions were seen. This closeness brought comfort to some and tension to others. Disagreements arose over resources, boundaries, and expectations. These conflicts were not new to human life, but their frequency increased with proximity. To manage this, customs began to form. Shared understandings about behavior, responsibility, and fairness emerged slowly. They were not written, not enforced by force, but remembered and repeated. Over time, these customs created a sense of order, an invisible framework that allowed many lives to coexist within a limited space. As the settlement grew, it also became more resilient. Food surplus provided security, stored grain softened the impact of poor harvests, shared labor made recovery from hardship faster. Knowledge accumulated, not just about survival, but about cooperation itself. The settlement began to feel permanent. People repaired homes instead of abandoning them. They invested time in structures meant to last. The idea of leaving became less common, not because movement was forbidden, but because staying made sense. And as people stayed, memory deepened. Landmarks gained meaning. Certain trees, paths, or open areas became associated with events, celebrations, losses, turning points. The physical environment slowly absorbed the emotional history of the people who lived within it. What had once been a temporary place now carried identity. The settlement was no longer just where life happened, it was who life belonged to. And as these bonds strengthened, the earliest cities continued to take shape, not as monuments or symbols, but as living systems, quietly evolving with every passing day. As these early cities stabilized, attention slowly shifted from survival to improvement. People began shaping their environment with intention. Paths that were once accidental became deliberate. Frequently used routes were cleared, flattened, and maintained, allowing people and goods to move more efficiently through the settlement. Over time, these paths became the earliest roads, not planned by architects, but carved by habit. Water management grew more sophisticated. Simple channels expanded into organized systems that guided water where it was needed most. Drainage prevented flooding, storage pits kept supplies dry. These changes were subtle, almost invisible, but they transformed daily life. Less time was spent reacting to nature, and more time was spent shaping it. With this stability came specialization. Not everyone needed to produce food anymore. Some focused entirely on crafting tools, pottery, or textiles. Others became builders, healers, or organizers. This division of labor allowed skills to deepen. Knowledge was refined through repetition, passed from one person to another. The city began to produce more than it consumed. Surplus goods opened the door to exchange. At first, trade happened locally between families, neighbors, nearby settlements. But gradually, cities reached outward. Goods traveled along rivers and paths, connecting distant communities that had never met face to face. Trade reshaped the city's identity. Foreign materials appeared, stone from far regions, metals not found locally, unfamiliar designs and techniques. These items were rare, valued, and often symbolic. They hinted at a world beyond the city's boundaries, expanding people's understanding of distance and possibility. As trade increased, coordination became critical. Agreements had to be remembered, exchanges had to be fair, trust extended beyond familiar faces to strangers. This required new systems of accountability, not laws yet, but shared expectations reinforced through reputation and memory. At the same time, inequality began to emerge. Those who controlled storage, trade routes, or specialized skills gained influence. Some homes grew larger, some people accumulated more resources than others. These differences were gradual, almost unnoticed at first, but over time they shaped how power flowed through the city. Leadership became more defined. No longer based only on familiarity, leadership began to tie itself to resources, coordination, and control. Certain individuals or groups managed distribution, organized labor, and protected surplus. Authority slowly shifted from informal respect to recognized roles. The city was changing internally and externally. As cities grew stronger, they began shaping the surrounding land. Fields expanded outward, roads linked satellite settlements. Smaller communities depended on the city for tools, trade, and protection, while the city relied on them for food and raw materials. A network formed. The city was no longer an isolated settlement, it became a center, economic, social, and cultural. Decisions made within its boundaries affected people far beyond its walls. With greater complexity came new challenges. Crowding increased, sanitation became an issue, disease spread more easily. Managing large populations required constant adaptation. The city demanded effort, organization, compromise, and shared responsibility, but in return, it offered opportunity. Opportunity for knowledge, opportunity for connection, opportunity for legacy. Generations were now born into cities, not just settlements. They inherited not only land and tools, but traditions, skills, and social roles. Life became structured by systems older than any individual. Urban life was no longer an experiment. It was a new way of being human. And though these first cities were fragile, imperfect, and often unstable, they marked a turning point, the moment humanity began living not just alongside one another, but within systems larger than themselves. As cities grew larger, memory alone was no longer enough. When everyone knew everyone, trust was personal. But in a city of thousands, most faces were unfamiliar. People needed ways to predict behavior, to know what was allowed, what was forbidden, and what would happen if boundaries were crossed. This was the quiet beginning of rules. At first, rules were not written. They lived in routine, in repeated actions, in shared consequences. Certain behaviors were tolerated, others discouraged. Social pressure did the work long before punishment did. But as cities expanded, informal control weakened. Conflicts became harder to resolve. Disputes over land, water, trade, and labor increased. Someone had to decide. Someone had to enforce. Authority slowly took shape, not as tyranny, but as coordination. Leaders emerged from necessity. Some organized irrigation schedules, others managed storage and redistribution, some mediated disputes. Their power came not from force, but from function. People followed because order benefited everyone, or at least most. Over time, authority became symbolic. Special clothing, elevated spaces, ritual roles, these separated leaders from the rest, not because they were superior, but because visibility reinforced legitimacy. The city needed to see order embodied in someone. Rules began to solidify. What started as custom turned into expectation. What was once flexible became fixed. Punishments were no longer improvised, they were anticipated. Justice, in its earliest form, was consistency. This consistency changed behavior. People adjusted not just out of fear, but out of habit. The city trained its inhabitants to think in terms of norms. Life became predictable, structured, and constrained, but also safer. Control extended beyond people. Time was regulated, work followed schedules, festivals aligned with seasons. The city imposed rhythm on human life, synchronizing thousands of individuals into a single system. And systems demanded maintenance. Records became necessary. Memory failed, but marks endured. Tallies tracked grain. Symbols represented debts. Communication shifted from oral to visual, the earliest steps toward writing. Writing did not begin as storytelling, it began as accounting. The city needed to remember itself. As rules, authority, and record-keeping expanded, power became abstract. No longer tied to a single person, it existed within institutions, roles that could be inherited, replaced, or challenged. The city was no longer just people living together, it was a machine, and every machine requires balance. As the city became more ordered, more regulated, and more abstract, something else quietly emerged alongside it. A need for meaning. Rules could shape behavior, authority could coordinate action, records could preserve memory, but none of these explained why the city existed or what place an individual held within it. People began to look beyond practicality. In early cities, daily life was uncertain. Floods came without warning, droughts stretched for years. Disease spread through dense populations. Death was visible, frequent, and often unexplained. The city magnified both achievement and fear. Belief became a way to understand forces that felt larger than human control, not as blind faith, but as interpretation, an attempt to give shape to chaos. At first, belief was woven into routine. Seasonal cycles were observed closely. Planting and harvesting followed patterns that felt intentional, almost alive. Rivers were not just water, they were providers, destroyers, and unpredictable partners in survival. Over time, these forces were personified. Nature became something that could listen, something that could be honored, appeased, or offended. Rituals emerged not just from superstition, but from repetition. Actions that seemed to work were repeated again and again. The city learned through pattern. Rituals created shared moments. Large gatherings synchronized emotion. When thousands participated in the same act, chanting, offering, observing silence, individuals felt absorbed into something larger. The city became not just a place, but a collective identity. Temples rose slowly. At first, they were simple structures, elevated platforms, marked spaces, or enclosed areas set apart from daily labor. Their purpose was not grandeur, but separation, a boundary between ordinary life and symbolic life. Inside these spaces, meaning was concentrated. Priests or ritual specialists emerged, not necessarily as rulers, but as interpreters. They understood calendars, symbols, and traditions. They preserved stories, recited lineages, and maintained continuity. Belief stabilized the city. It gave explanation to suffering. It justified hierarchy. It reinforced rules not just as social agreements, but as cosmic order. To disobey was no longer just a personal act, it disrupted balance. This made authority feel inevitable. The city's structure mirrored its beliefs. High places housed gods. Central spaces symbolized power. The layout of streets, temples, and homes reflected an invisible logic, one that told people where they belonged. Identity shifted. People were no longer defined only by family or skill. They were members of a city, followers of particular rituals, participants in shared myths. Belonging became psychological as much as physical. Stories gained importance, not entertainment, but instruction. Stories explained origins, warned against chaos, and preserved values. They were repeated because they worked. They made the city coherent. Even conflict was absorbed into belief. Failure could be interpreted as moral imbalance. Success became divine favor. This allowed the city to continue without constant questioning of its structure. Belief softened uncertainty. It did not eliminate fear, but it framed it. Death, loss, and disaster were no longer random. They were meaningful, even if painful. The city had learned how to justify itself. But belief also introduced fragility. When systems depend on shared meaning, doubt becomes dangerous. When belief hardens, adaptation slows. When ritual replaces observation, reality pushes back. And slowly, beneath order and meaning, tension grew. The city was powerful, but it was not permanent. Even as belief, rules, and social order strengthened the city, fragility quietly persisted. Cities were not immutable. They depended on water, food, labor, trust, and attention. A single failure in any of these systems could ripple outward, affecting thousands. And sometimes, despite the best efforts, systems faltered. Floods that were once predictable could become destructive. Droughts could stretch for seasons, threatening stored grain. Conflicts, when repeated and unresolved, could fracture neighborhoods. Disease spread more easily in dense spaces, claiming life and disrupting work. Cities, in their complexity, became vulnerable to forces both natural and human. Yet collapse was rarely sudden. It began quietly, imperceptibly. Paths became less traveled, fields yielded less, trust eroded, customs and rituals persisted, but their meaning shifted. What once held a community together now felt fragile. Those who once coordinated daily life lost influence. Labor was uneven, tasks neglected, and memories faded. And then, slowly, people began to leave. Homes emptied, and spaces once alive with sound and movement fell silent. Stones remained, paths became overgrown, walls crumbled. Yet even in abandonment, the city left traces, the shape of streets, the alignment of buildings, the remnants of storage pits. These were not monuments, but fingerprints of human life. Even in collapse, the city influenced the world around it. Neighboring settlements observed, adopted, or adapted. Knowledge about tools, trade, and social organization traveled beyond its borders. Ideas survived even when the people did not. Cities also left lessons for those who remained. The importance of water management, shared labor, and coordination became part of collective memory. Symbols, rituals, and customs continued in nearby villages. The experience of living closely together, negotiating space and authority, was absorbed and remembered by the next generation. The first cities were teachers, even in their disappearance. And in their rise and fall, something enduring emerged. The concept of urban life, a place where humans could gather, work, trade, believe, and belong, was no longer an experiment. It had become an idea, a possibility repeated and refined across time and geography. Each new settlement learned from the ones before, building on successes, avoiding past mistakes, and slowly shaping what we now recognize as civilization. The first cities were fragile, temporary, imperfect, yet they carried the essence of human ambition. They taught humans how to live together, how to organize, how to create meaning in concentrated life, and how to leave a legacy that could outlast individual lives. Their walls, paths, and memories echo through history, shaping not just the people who lived there, but all who followed. And so, even as cities rose and fell, humanity continued. Each generation inherited the lessons of the past and quietly, inevitably, built the foundations of the cities we know today.